Okay, everybody, I think we're going to get started. Good afternoon to you. I seem to be, I looked at the timetable and I'm competing with lunch, which is quite a difficult one to do, isn't it? Welcome to all of you. My name is Paul Turner. Two things before I get started. Firstly, thank you for inviting me. And second, what an absolute pleasure it is to be here. What a fantastic place. I've been really enjoying myself. So I'm hoping to enjoy myself for the next half an hour, and I hope you'll enjoy it too. A couple of things. I don't know how many of you were in Adrian's previous presentation, but there's a couple of things that came up in the questions there that I'd kind of like to answer a little bit if I can as I go through. The topic I'm going to do with you is something called systems thinking, and it's something I feel very strongly about, and something that I think we can all use no matter what our jobs or no matter what our roles are. But I decided when I was thinking about what to talk about here, I decided to pick something that maybe you don't know much about, maybe you know lots about it, and by the end of the half an hour I'm pretty sure you'll all agree that you know a lot more about it than you thought you did, but it's just a case of whether you concentrate on doing it. And one of the things that came up previously was this very important idea of the difference between doing the right thing and doing it right. And I think we've probably all in our lives worked really hard and done some really good things, and it's turned out to be the wrong thing. Right? I'm sure we've sometimes done the other way around as well, and we've done the right thing very badly, but let's not worry about that one. Okay, so the trick is to do the right thing and to do it right. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that, but I also want to talk about something else that I think everybody here probably thinks about, which is the difference between what a business analyst means in some organisations and what it might mean in another organisation. And I've heard many definitions. Alexander's question was around that, wasn't it? That there are lots of different definitions. So I thought what I would do is I would start with my definition. And it's quite a broad definition, and I think it covers at least 5 different types of business analyst. And I'm going to focus on one of those for the entire time now. So first thing is business analysis I've seen over many years has got bigger and bigger and broader and wider, and more things have been piled into it, and it now covers, I think, 4 things, with maybe 5. You can see the 5th one in the middle there. The first bit is some business analysts get very involved with strategic analysis at the very highest level, working with the business, with the organisation about what direction it should go. And whether that's somebody called a business analyst or whether it's just somebody with business analysis skills who have to do that job, doesn't really matter. Then we go into what I think of as the main part of business analysis, which is help people shape their projects, help people come up with ideas, and help people decide which ideas are best. That then feeds into something that I'm sure you have here as much as we have in the UK, which is nobody will give you any money on a project unless you have a good reason for doing it. So we need to have a good input into the business case to make sure that we're doing the right things. Then we go into maybe a more traditional side of business analysis, which is requirements engineering, the whole area of defining detailed requirements, managing them, etc. And then from that, hopefully, solution definition and delivery. Right? So it's quite a big journey, and I know business analysts that work, if you like, at all of those levels. For the purposes of today, I want to focus purely on the very first one of those. Well, actually a little bit on the business analysis bit, but certainly in that fluffy cloud at the top. And by the end of my session, hopefully you'll understand why it's a fluffy cloud and why it's not a box. But they do lead on, and actually you often have to think about them backwards. If I'm going to deliver the right thing, how am I going to develop it? If I'm going to develop the right thing, how do I define what the requirements are? If they're the right requirements, how do they help the business, and will that business be able to achieve its strategy? But I'm not going to do it backwards, you'll be pleased to know. Right? So I'm going to do it forwards. Okay. The other thing that happens in my job, I get very involved with business analysis, and we're running the conference in September in London as well. I'm on the organising committee for that. Is that however much we think we've understood what business analysis is, it seems to change all the time. And suddenly new words, not new words, but words take higher priorities. And the 4 things I've been hearing a lot in the last year have been in the area of strategic analysis, this whole area of business architecture, perhaps moving the role up a level. The bit I'm picking on is systems thinking, because that's really something that a lot of people are talking about. In requirements engineering, everybody's putting more emphasis on modelling, and in solution development, we can't go too far without the word agile, can we? I had to get that out of the way nice and quickly, because you can't do anything without the word agile. So I'm going to go back up to the systems thinking bit, and in a sense, I suppose, what I want to do during the period we've got together is three things, each of which would take a lot longer than I've got. I'm going to quickly define what a system is, then I'm going to talk about what systems thinking is, and then I'm going to talk about how it can help you and me as business analysts. So that's the kind of structure of what I want to do. So let's focus in on a system. And I want to use a bit of a definition. Sorry there's a lot of words on this first one, but it's quite important to understand the distinction between what is called systematic approach and a systems approach. And a systematic approach, which I'm not going to talk about, is very procedural, step by step. Everybody does things pretty much the same way, and that we will all break things down, as it says there, into as smaller pieces as possible and do our bit. What I want to talk about is how those bits all fit together, rather than the individual pieces. So I'm going to look at systems thinking. Peter Senge, who's written a fantastic book in this area, I can't think of a better definition, really, than systems thinking is a systemic approach, a discipline for seeing the whole thing. Right? That doesn't mean we lose track of our own bit, but the definition of seeing our own thing. So that leaves us with an idea of what systems thinking is. I'm not going to spend very long defining what a system is, but I will. And perhaps with this little diagram here, a system could be, possibly, a little tiny piece of code sitting within a computer program. It could be the computer program, it could be the process in which the computer program sits, it could be the business in which the process sits, or it could be the country in which the business sits, or it could be the universe in which our planet sits, and I don't want to go on. Okay? So you can see it can get quite big or it can get quite small, and we've got to kind of decide where we are. But one thing that's true about all systems, not one thing, all things on there really, something comes in, something happens to it, and something different comes out. And hopefully that something different that comes out is better. Right? We hope. Right? That's why we have feedback. So we've used the word system a lot. We use nervous system, digestive system, although we don't want to think about the inputs and outputs of that one particularly. We do also have metro systems, solar systems, but they all have in common something comes in, something happens to it, and something goes out. Right? That's a pretty good start point for a definition of a system. They have feedback loops, and the system needs to react in some way to that feedback. I'm not really at this point worried about whether it's an IT system or a business system or whatever it is. But it is worth mentioning that when people talk about systems analysts, and we've heard the word a lot over the last couple of days I've been here, they are talking primarily about IT systems analysts as opposed to business systems analysts or even systems analysts who analyse entire businesses. Or further. So what are the other characteristics? Well, I was thinking about that. There's only about 4 other characteristics to quickly share with you on systems. The first one is very appropriate, I suspect, and that is when we look inside a system, guess what we find? Another system. And when we look inside that, another system. And when we look inside that, another system. And hopefully, these systems within systems gradually provide us with the right output. And we can change things, even from this slide, we can change things at different levels. We could change things at the very internal bit, but if the knock-on effect of that is to cause the output to be different, we have the second problem with systems. The second problem with systems is guess where those outputs go? Another system. Guess where those inputs came from? Another system. So wherever you're working, there's a bit more detail down below, but there's always something up above. Right? Now, I don't think any of us can get our head around the entire way the world works and how it communicates, so I'm not going to try and do that. What I think we could probably do is at least understand where the stuff is coming from, and at least understand where it's going to, and possibly maybe a bit further. Right? The reason this is all important to us in our jobs, I think, is that we actually very often, and you'll see this in a minute, we very often solve problems inside our own box. And we think that was nice and quick, that was nice and easy, and don't realise that further down the line, the whole thing is horrendous. Right? So there's that. So just quickly to recap, we've got systems within systems, and they all interconnect, and we hope that they interconnect in a sensible way. outside of each system is another system. So far we've got 3 of the main characteristics of a system. I think the 4th one is probably the main one for us, and that's what, terrible phrase I know, but it's called the emergent properties of systems. And that means that all the little bits might work, but that doesn't matter if they don't work together. Right? Imagine in a car, all the various bits work, but it doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't matter how many times the mechanic says, but all the bits are working. Right? Then we have a problem. So what we've really got is the systems themselves and the interactions between them giving us this idea of emergent properties. Now, I don't know how many developers or programmers there are in the room or have done any development or programming. Have you ever had a situation where somebody says a system has crashed or a program has got an error in it, and you say, well, I know I changed it, but I didn't change that bit? Anyone ever had that? Right? You've changed a bit over here, haven't you? And you tested it over here, but the problem came over here, so it couldn't be you, could it? Well, there's a fighting chance it probably was you, because you're the only one who touched it. Right? And that happens because of the emergent properties of systems. Right? Because you worked out your bit, not where it fits with anywhere else. Luckily in IT, of course, we've got that sorted. So if I load a new component on my laptop, everything works beautifully together, doesn't it? Or maybe it doesn't. Maybe I load something and it doesn't interact with the rest of the stuff I've got. Right? So we have to think of that sort of bigger picture, if you like. Now, before we do that, I think I've just about got time to do a little exercise. Anyone fancy doing a little exercise quickly before we do it? I want you to just bear with me. This will only take a couple of minutes, I hope. Before we do the next bit, could you just look around the room and just identify 2 people? I don't care where they are, and I certainly don't mind if you know them or not. Just in your mind, identify 2 people. The ones at the front will have to look round, I'm sure. Right, just as far away or as near as you want. You all got 2 people in your mind? Does that make sense? Okay. Now this might not work, so bear with me. I'd like you all now very quickly to move to a position that is halfway between the 2 people you thought of. Okay, so you've still got the 2 people in your mind.
Stój tam.
Oops. Okay, is everybody in the right place? Or do you want to move again? I think you've got to move again. Go and sit down. Right. Okay. Chaos. Why was it chaos? Well, it wasn't that bad, actually. But what was happening? You thought you were moving, but what was happening to the 2 people that you were trying to get between? They were also moving, weren't they? And it never settled. And actually, if I had all day, we still wouldn't settle, right? Because we would always move, right? And that's what happens in business, and that's what happens in systems. You're doing your bit. You've got yourself nicely positioned between the 2 pieces, and somebody else has moved. What you've done has been affected. So, how we deal with that, we're going to try and talk about now in a few minutes. Okay, so that's the background to systems. Let's just for a minute remember we're not talking about any type of systems. We probably are talking about business systems. So when we're talking about business systems, I use a model. Let's move away from the fluffy cloud for a minute. We use a model at Assist, which we call the pocket model. It says a business comprises of organisations, people, processes, information and technology, rather than information technology. So information and technology. And it's very important as a business analyst, I believe anyway, to think about that whole picture, not just our bit. So it actually doesn't matter if you're in technology or in data or in process or whatever, you have to think of the other bits as well. Because those 4 things are like you moving around. If you align 2 of them, then one of the others goes wrong. Right? So you change your technology, but you don't change your process, you have a problem. So we want to try and think about that as a complete picture of business systems, with the BA taking responsibility for coordinating and understanding. Also, and I want to talk about this in a few minutes as well, is just to avoid what I'm sure we're all quite used to, which is siloed thinking. The idea, I don't know if you know the term, but where we think about our department, well actually everybody does it, don't we? We think about ourselves, and then maybe we think about our family, and then maybe we think about a few friends, and then eventually we think about our job, and then maybe we think about, so we all think a little bit sort of narrowly. So it tries to avoid that and makes everybody sort of share things. And to do that, we've got to see the whole picture. Now, I'm going to tell you a story. You may have heard it before. It's a story about 6 blind men. And many of you will have seen it. It's a very, very common story in the systems world. It's the story of the 6 blind men. And the first of the men wanders up, remember they're blind, and they go up to the body of the elephant and they feel it and they say, And then what we found? We found a wall. Right? And the other guy, next guy comes along and says, well, he's got the tail. He says, no, I don't think it's a wall, I think it's a piece of rope. Right? The third guy comes along and says, he's got the ear, and he says, no, it's a very large fan. I can feel it flapping, there's air. It's definitely a fan. The fourth guy goes, well, it can't be a fan because it feels like a spear to me. Right? It sounds very dangerous, very pointy. And the next guy says, and this one's got the trunk. He says, no, you're all wrong. It's definitely a snake, and it feels quite dangerous here. And they've got the trunk, by the way. It's definitely a snake. And then the next one has got the leg, and he thinks it's a tree. Right? And they're all right about their piece, aren't they? But none of them have got the big picture, right? Unless they sit down and talk to each other. Right? But the other thing that's important is none of those are right, because it's actually an elephant. Right? And if you cut it in half, you don't get two elephants. You get a dead elephant, don't you? Right? So it's sometimes the emergent properties again there, isn't it? The idea that the whole thing is probably more important than all the little pieces. If you take one of those pieces away, I suspect the elephant isn't going to be very pleased. That's a very well-known systems thinking story. My own end to the story is I think there were 7 blind men, and one of them gets a very, very hot apple pie, and not the best job of feeling it, but then you might like that. Okay, so we sometimes, in effect, we are trying to solve problems, but sometimes, actually, we are part of the problem. Right? And I want to talk a little bit about why we are part of the problem, and that's because I suppose that isn't a bad story for if somebody said, I think what I want to improve is this part, they could improve it beautifully, and we would have a really nice spear, and we'd have a really nice fan, but what we wouldn't have is what we needed, which is a kind of working animal. So, that leads us on to this idea of how it affects us in business. Okay, so I want to look at the next topic. There's a few in here. So we've got the idea of the whole picture, got the idea of things all interacting with each other, and so, but we don't want to drill down into too much detail. I suppose the elephant would be a good example then. We're quite happy with it at the elephant bit, but we could go up one and look at an entire herd or a jungle, or we could go down and look at the parts of the elephant. So let's have a look at the next topic, which is actually around the area of what we call systems change or systemic change. This is where we have to be very careful of the impact of the change before we do it. I mean, we find out afterwards, can't we? We can knock a wall down in our house because we fancy a bit more air, and suddenly the whole house falls down. Right? Because the house falls down, it causes subsidence, and the street falls down. Because the street falls down, we just knock the entire country down, just because we changed only one wall, wasn't it, really? And we may do the equivalent of that, I guess, in software terms sometimes. We may make a minor change, go live with the software, because we didn't understand the impact. And I don't mean just the impact of other bits of software change, I mean the impact on the business. Right? The fact that somebody's got to change the way they work. Their staff have got to be trained to work in a new way. Their data may have to be converted. There's a whole bunch of stuff that we need to consider. We need to consider it before the business case, because it's going to cost money. So we need to see the bigger picture, and I think that's not a bad example there of you stick a pin in one place and it solves a lot of problems. It's a lot better than doing lots and lots of major things. Sometimes what happens is we take very, very complicated solutions to problems when there's probably a simpler solution facing us. So that's that one. Let's just look at another example of that. This poor guy here is sitting there and he's just knocking down a piece of stone, isn't he? And that's fine. But he doesn't realise that it's going to come back and get him later. We might like that, but we might not. So most solutions to most problems, maybe I'm a very cynical person, but most solutions to problems do solve that problem, but they create other problems that need to be solved. And we can solve those problems, but they create other problems that can also be solved. And we're in a loop forever if we're not very, very careful. So we really need to touch what I call touch points, to find the touch points that mean if I solve the problem like that, it actually solves a lot of problems rather than just one individual. So that's still sticking with this ways of thinking. So it's just something, as I said, we can all share and do in our jobs. We can sit back, we can do our piece of work, or we can take a few minutes to think about how will that impact others. Right? And I don't think that's just a case of us thinking that. I think we would all hope that the others think how what they're doing will impact us. Because quite often people will give you a piece of work and say, I've made this change, could you document it, or something like that. It's only a small change. How many people have heard that? It's only a small change. Right, okay. So, let's have a look at that. Now, that's a kind of a little bit of a break point in what I want to talk about, because I mentioned Peter Senge a little bit earlier, and he has a couple of really good ideas in his book, one of which, and the book is about 20 years old, maybe more, but he has in it a phrase that I love. It's called the disease of the hierarchy. Right? And it talks about organisations that are very based on the idea of control, management and organisation. So everybody's thinking about who is working where, and a lot of people spend a lot of time talking about which department people are in and where they should be and who's in charge of what bit. And of course it happens everywhere, it happens in my company as well. And he said, well, that's not wrong, but it does create its own problems that make it difficult to work as an organisation. And it's also particularly difficult when part of that organisation is outsourced or part of that organisation is another department. So he said, instead of thinking about control, management and organisation as business analysts, let's think about three different things. We've still got to think about those first ones, but maybe not as much. And these are values, vision, and this idea of something called a mental model. So I want to just spend a couple of minutes on each one of those, and the three of them do work the way I've shown it there in the form of a triangle, in that they all impact each other as we go. And values, I think, is probably a good one to start with. So if we look at values, I think the danger with the left-hand side here is those values, we think of the values of our managers sometimes, we think of the values of the rest of our own team, but it's pretty important to get inside the head of our customers, isn't it? Whoever they may be. Right? So to think in terms of values of the customers is pretty key. And this slide really says that internally, yes, we can think about the knock-on effect to our processes and our systems, but most of our organisations work with other companies. While it might be a simple change for us, when we post it on to the next company, they've got to change all their procedures just because we've made a minor change in some data we're sending them, or a minor change in the form. So we need to think outside our organisational boundaries, because our customers, they might be other organisations in the software world, but they might be end customers as well, will have different expectations and different needs. And they may not work with the company that sells the best software or the best solution. They may be happier to work with the ones that are easier to work with. Right? That pay on time, release things when they say they're going to release them and all those sorts of things. So we've got expectations there. Now the other thing about that, and before I go into the next couple of bits, I've not mentioned it on there, but I did mention mental model. Now mental model is what's going on in all of our heads at any point in time. And if we don't have the same mental model of something, then we're likely to be confused when we try and communicate. Right? Adrian earlier used an example, I'm going to use a similar one in a minute. But the book that I've got involved with writing, we're going to have I've got a copy of the book which somebody will win soon. But when we were doing it, a really strange thing happened about mental models. We got an email saying we're now publishing it as an e-book as well. Do you want the same cover or a different one? And I just suddenly thought, it's an e-book. Does it actually need a cover? And I realised it was a really good example of a mental model. Because if people read e-books, they want a cover, they want a contents, and they want page turning. There's absolutely no reason why it has to be that way. But that's what we're all used to, isn't it? So to move people into something that wasn't a book still was a big move. Right? And that's what mental models are all about, ways of communicating between people. So we're a bit concerned about that one. Now that was values. Let's look at vision. Vision is a dangerous thing because if we're looking at big systems and small systems, we all need the ability to do both. We need to look at the detail, but we also need to be able to look at the future. I'm sure most people here drive. When you're driving, you do this without really thinking about it. You are looking at what's about to happen 2 yards in front of you, in case you're going to knock somebody off a bicycle or something, but you're also looking ahead to see where the junction is and those things. You're doing both somehow. Right? And I think in business, we probably need to do things. We need to make today work, but we also need to be thinking about some sort of future direction. And some people do have this balance between the vision of where we will be in 3-4 years' time, as a model, and that's why it leads into mental models in a minute, but there is the reality and the detail of the day-to-day situation. Right? So, let's take that forward into bit more on vision. I wasn't sure if I'm going to use this, but I'm going to use it because it's my favourite quote, right? Second favourite quote, my favourite one's coming up in there. Michelangelo. Michelangelo has done this wonderful sculpture called David, and he said, in every block of marble I see a statue as plain as though it stood before me, perfect in every way. All I have to do is release it. Now that's a brilliant, I think, a brilliant example of vision. He can already see what the solution is. All he's got to do is chip away and release it so others can see it. Right? Very clear sort of vision. Adrian earlier mentioned the tube map in London. It would be impossible to get across London, pretty impossible, I guess, to get across Minsk on the metro as well, unless we had the same mental model. If we're all using different maps, I suspect we'd have a bit of a problem. So this is a shared understanding of the model. So, where does this affect business analysts? Well, first of all, it is very complicated to understand everything. Einstein was a pretty clever guy, and he said things should be done as simple as possible, but no simpler. Right? Now, so in other words, keep things simple, but don't oversimplify them so they're not very good. Right? And I think that comes back to, if you can solve a complicated problem in an easy way, then you should do so. So, the last little bit then, more or less the finished bit, with one example at the end, is that there are 3 things that we can do as business analysts to help us pull all of that together. The first one is, I'm not going to do these techniques, I'm just going to mention them. One is called getting a picture, a rich picture of the scope of the organisation. So a tube map is a rich picture, it's a mental model of a very complicated situation. There's an example of a rich picture, but there's an example of a very fluffy cat sitting in some marshmallows. Nothing at all to do with the presentation, but your immediate reaction is probably, ah, isn't it? Okay, so I don't have to say, we can all say ah together, I just show you that. The rich picture on the side there's to do with something else, don't worry. But it's actually one of the ones we're going to use in the training session this afternoon. The second thing we can do is understand different people's views. It's easy to understand our own. We have to stand in somebody else's shoes, look through their lens, look through their glasses, etc., and see the world. I said I had one quote from my own personal hero, and Bob Dylan says, "You're right from your side and I'm right from mine." It's pretty well true, right? Everybody's right from their own point of view. So we need to somehow, as business analysts, take other people's points of view. So the final thing is to understand the gap between the vision, where we want to be, and where we currently are, because that's a journey, and there's lots of different ways of doing that journey. And some are good and some are bad. So I'm going to finish with a very simple story, and I loved it when I first heard it. So here's where we are. This is a lady in Africa, and every day, 4 or 5 times a day, she has to put that on her head and walk just over that hill to get some water to bring back to the village. And if she brings too much water back, it's very heavy, but also it dries out and she hasn't got any water for the village. So there's obviously a problem there of some sorts. What they really like is they really want to be with a pump in the village, pumping the water so that that journey isn't necessary. So basically there's a problem there. But like I said, when you solve one problem, you get another one. The first problem there was it was quite expensive to drill that well, but it was even more expensive to put any sort of power behind getting the water out. So it was really hard work to pump the water out. So what they did was this. They have a water tower where they store some of it, but they found a source of energy to pump the water up next to the playground. And the children play on this roundabout, and one of the resources they have in the village is lots and lots of children. And the children love playing on that all day, and what that does is it powers the pump, and the water comes up out of the well. There's no electricity needed or anything else. Now, to me, that is a really good example of systems thinking, right? Because that is using the resources you've got to solve the problem that you've got without creating any more problems. And in fact, nobody in that village complains at all, because the children love it, the adults love it. That is therefore systems thinking. That summary is just all of the various bits. I've talked about them all as quickly as I could. I don't want to go through them all again, but they're all on there. All of that together is just something you need to keep in your mind, I think, when you're doing any sort of job going forward. And it will mean, with a bit of luck, that the phrase we've both used a lot, you'll make sure you're doing the right thing before you put too much effort into doing it right. And we will end up building, designing and building systems that actually people value and they want, because we've not made major change out of what may be very simple problem. So think that's about right timing-wise. Okay. Obviously we're going to do some questions. I think, Maria, we had an idea about the questions, didn't we? Which was, I have a copy of a little book that some of you may have come across called Business Analysis Techniques, which I wrote, which contains some of this stuff. And we said we would dangerously, I was going to wait till after we'd done the questions, but I think I'll be brave. We said we'd give a copy to whoever asked the best question. Although I still believe it should be whoever gives the best answer. Right? Okay, so, questions?
Let me try to ask a question. I have actually 2 questions, and both of them...
I've only got one book.
If you get back to your slide with the children producing energy, can you give us an example of viewing the problem in further perspective?
Okay, yeah, definitely. I think I can. And it may not be the problem. You have to have a second question.
Let me ask the second question. The second question is, do you have any technique that really helps you to get rid of that narrow vision of the problem?
Yeah, definitely. The answer to both of those, I think. I hope so. One with the perspectives. The other perspective that was in here was the company that wanted to sell the pumping equipment to the village. They said the only thing you can do here is spend vast amounts of money to drill very deep holes and put in place a very big power thing, and you're going to need electricity, right, which you didn't have in the village, but we can organise that for you. And that perspective was they were very much trying to sell a product. I don't know if that answers that bit. In terms of the technique, actually it is in the book. You'd expect it to be, wouldn't you? But it's a technique that says look at each perspective separately and then build a model of what that perspective would do and try to merge them together. That works. Right? It does always, I mean it's difficult, and I think it's one of the most difficult things about being a business analyst is to understand that this was probably a win-win, but it wasn't really a win-win, was it, if you were running the company that was selling pumping equipment? Right? So in any change that's worth doing, there is a winner and there's usually a loser. Right? The world of balance. Right? So I don't know if that answers it. There is some techniques, and I'm sure we can chat afterwards in more detail. And we're doing a little bit of them, aren't we, in the training session this afternoon, so maybe we'll do some later. You're winning so far.
I've been doing a lot of my experience as well, that you have to say big picture to reach where we want and get what we want, right? And so basically it's back engineering. And there's a lot of techniques and how really reach their own way, right? And I just have one thing. It's basically from my vision, is to be a business analyst is a gift of way of thinking, or you can actually learn how to be a business analyst.
Well,
because you have to have a certain set of mind.
Very good question. What we've been doing...
To make this journey.
No? Can you hear me right? Yeah, I'm answering this one. You step back. We've got a lot of stuff going on in England at the moment where people are looking at what the qualities and skills and competencies of a business analyst need to be. We ended up splitting them into 3 areas. One was business skills of some sort. One was technical skills around business analysis, and the other one was interpersonal type ways of thinking. And interestingly enough, that one came out quite high with some business analysts recently, that people said you probably did have to have a very methodical way of thinking. You need to be the sort of person who, whenever you're faced with a queue or wherever you're faced with buying something, you think, I could do that better. Right? I don't know if that makes sense. So I think you probably have to have an inquiring mind. I do think, however, you can teach systems thinking. And in fact, we do it in some of the courses that we've got, where we give people problems and ask them to solve them. So I guess that has to be an advert for our stuff this afternoon, doesn't it, really? Because we're going to look at problem solving a little bit this afternoon. So great question.
You said it's very good idea. We should choose a right level of optimization.
Yeah.
Yes. But are there techniques to stay on this level in right time?
Yeah, to not go too far or not to...
Yes.
Yeah. Yes, I think there are. What we do, I don't know if I can go back, well, maybe it's worth thinking. One of the things we do is we look at the outcome and then work back until it's called a value chain. You work back until you get to the point where you're not adding value to the end, and you say, I'll treat that as one box. Right? So if you find lots of things inside that are just not really, they're adding, but they're not completing the job, treat them in one. Right? Now, I could probably draw that, I won't try and do it now, but if you imagine 4 boxes, and you've got lots of arrows going backwards and forwards between the 4 boxes, it's probably a good idea to look at those 4 boxes together. If all the arrows are inside one of the boxes, and you hardly ever come out, don't know if I'm explaining that properly, but then that's probably a good idea to keep separately. So if you're sitting at a desk and someone's sitting at the next desk, and all you're doing is communicating with them all the time to solve a problem, it's much better that you work together. Right? Does that make sense? And that tells you the level-ish. But you'll get it wrong, and then you'll get it within 2. Probably. Okay? Time for a couple more, I think.
One more.
Maria's going to decide which was the best question, by the way. Oh, no, I don't want to decide. That's really unfair. Right? Okay? Well, thank you very much. And we will decide. The people who asked the questions, why don't you come down the front and we'll sort of decide.
Maybe you can decide right now?
Oh, I've got to decide right now. Oh, that's really unfair. Okay, could the 3 questions... I'm going to give it to the gentleman who asked 2 questions. Okay? Is that all right? Sorry.